Thank you, everyone, for coming. As Denise said, I'm going to now sort of switch the focus in a way from some of the more macro-level data sets that you've been talking about. And I'm going to talk about, well, what I think is a particularly challenging area in cross-national research, which is survey research, trying to collect data about people's attitudes and values and beliefs. And I'm going to do that by focusing on two of the most well-known cross-national surveys that, and certainly the ones that I have the most direct experience of, which are the International Social Survey Programme and the European Social Survey. And I was delighted to see that there's actually a poster outside that someone has put up here using data from the European Social Survey, which you heard a little bit about earlier on today. So I'm going to start by talking about the International Social Survey Programme. I won't go through every slide in exhaustive detail, but the key points to make that it began in the 1980s and it's taken place every year ever since. Its funding and structure, I think the key points to make is that there's an elected secretariat which currently is based in Norway, and they basically organise the countries together. It doesn't have any central funding, and I'll come back to that later on as being an issue when thinking about ISSP and the data that it produces. And then within individual countries, they raise their own funding for the surveys. And there's now over 40 members spanning all the main continents in the world, although it's fair to say that there's only one member in Africa, and that's South Africa, who's a fairly recent member. The list of all the member countries is there, and I think you've got these slides in your pack, so I won't go through them in any detail. A couple of general points to make. Some of the members, particularly in Europe, including Eastern Europe, are very long-term members. And so for those countries, we've got data going back over 2-3 decades on particular topics. The US has also been a member for a very long time, as has Australia. So we have got a number of countries where we've got time series data going back to the 1980s. In terms of topics, the way ISSP works is that every year all the member countries field in their country a questionnaire with agreed questions in it, obviously translated as appropriate, on a particular topic. And the whole point behind ISSP is that not only is it trying to collect cross-national data, but it's also trying to build in a time series element so that over time people will be able to look within individual countries or within a range of countries at how people's attitudes, values and beliefs are changing over time. So you can see at the top of the slide, you've got some areas, and the most obvious examples would be role of government and social inequality, where we've had 4 surveys on that already. So within those countries who've taken part from the beginning of ISSP, we've already got 4 rounds of data on those particular topics. Towards the bottom of the slide, you'll see some new modules that were introduced comparatively recently to try and make sure that ISSP is covering a whole range of very relevant topics. And obviously it's necessary for us to include new topics because what's of interest to the social science community will change as social conditions change and develop over time. So the most recent one that was introduced was sport and leisure, which was fielded last year. And then in 2011, we've already got agreement to field a module of questions looking at health and healthcare seeking. Now, in terms of the field work, every country who participates in ISSP, the basic deal is that you have to do 1,000 or more interviews with a random population sample within your country. I've included the word expectation of random sampling there very deliberately because there are some countries in ISSP that don't manage to do proper random sampling in the way that it would be defined in Britain, certainly. And I think one of the issues with ISSP is that although it has very, very lofty aims and ambitions, sometimes it's not able to actually realise those in practice and reality. And I'm happy to take questions about that at the end if anyone's interested. In terms of field work, all countries field those 60 questions in the form of either a face-to-face interview or a self-completion survey. And the self-completion survey can be left behind by an interviewer or it can be posted out to respondents. In Britain, we take part in ISSP through something called the British Social Attitude Survey, and basically everyone who takes part in that survey is then left a small questionnaire booklet with the ISSP questions, which they then return later. And the actual questionnaire itself basically comprises 60 questions. As I mentioned earlier, these are agreed in advance and can't be deviated from. They're asked in a set order that can't be changed. And then there's also a set of agreed background questions, which every country who participates has to field, although they can do that in their own way. And examples of questions there would be things like the age of the respondent, their sex, some details about their household, their employment, their educational background, and so on. In terms of questionnaire design, topics are nominated and then voted for at an annual plenary meeting, and at that meeting there'll be at least one representative from each of the 43 countries who participate in ISSP. And then the design of the module basically takes the form of, it's an iterative process whereby a draft questionnaire is sent round ISSP members at various points. They get the opportunity to comment on them. There's usually a pilot test of any new questions. And then there's at the relevant plenary meeting, there's effectively a vote where you go through the questionnaire and you vote for and against relevant questions. And the basic rule, and this comes back to ISSP's aim of being a time series data collection exercise as well as a cross-national one, the basic rule is that if you're repeating a module that's been asked before, you have to include 40 repeat questions within your 60 item module. So only 20 questions can actually be new ones in any given year. In terms of data, it's provided to a central archive in Germany within 9 months of fieldwork. That central archive does not get any central funding. And there is quite a long delay before the data set's actually made available to the academic community. And so, for example, the most recent data set is actually from the 2006 Role of Government. And that's certainly one drawback with ISSP, is simply the speed it takes to get the data processed and out there in a form that's accessible to data users. And I've included on there the website that you can get the data set from, or else there are links that you can use from the ESDS website that will direct you there. So that's ISSP. Now a few quick words about the European Social Survey, ESS. It only began in 2002, so it's a much shorter running survey series, and it only takes place every 2 years. So in fact, we've only got 4 rounds of data so far. There's actually the 2008 round is currently ongoing in the member countries. It was the winner of the Dakar Prize in 2005 for radical innovations in cross-national survey design. And I mention that simply to get across the point that ESS is very much seen as the gold standard in cross-national surveys. And indeed, in some countries, it's shown that you can do surveys to a standard that previously wasn't thought possible in those countries. Structure and funding, I won't go through in detail. Suffice to say that ESS gets a considerable amount of core funding from the European Commission. So in that sense, it's very different to ISSP. It gets core funding to support various staff. It gets core funding to support development work looking at questionnaire design, mode effects, and so on. So it's a much better resourced survey than ISSP. But like ISSP, all the countries who participate have to raise the money themselves to do that. There's no central funding for the actual surveys. There's a list of current ESS member countries there. It's been fairly constant over the first 4 rounds of the survey. It has grown slightly since the 2002 round. You'll notice straight away that it's not just restricted to EU countries. In the past, it hasn't taken part this year, but Turkey, for example, has taken part in the past. And in fact, in the first round, Israel took part. So it's clearly a very, very broad definition of Europe in that sense. In terms of the questionnaire, there are a series of different elements to the questionnaire that you need to be aware of. There's a series of core modules, and I'll say a little bit more about what those look like later on. And the idea of those is that they're repeated every round. So on those particular topics, you'll get data every time ESS takes place. There's also rotating modules, usually about 50 items in each module, and they will vary for each round. And again, I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. All the participating countries also have to collect a set level of socio-demographic and economic background variables just like ISSP, but far more comprehensive. So that will include things like household composition, educational background, and so on. And then finally, all the participating countries also have to deposit a set of context and event data. And the context data will include macro-level statistics of the sort that you've already been discussing today, but also background about things like the educational system within that particular country, the age at which people traditionally leave school, and so on, just to help analysts gain a better handle on what's going on in the countries that they're analysing.